Good morning to all our witnesses, and thank you for coming here. And I just want to first of all commend the work of Inclusion Ireland and the work you do for working towards inclusion and advocating for people with intellectual disabilities. And just to talk to you first, Derval, I mean, you concentrate a lot on education here this morning, and I think it's so important because I think if you have a proper, appropriate, inclusive education, it will mean so much to that child as they progress through life, and that's not happening because we still hear of children, as you said, travelling long distances to get an appropriate school placement, but also the short school days. The expulsions are still happening, and it's an absolute disgrace. And I mean, I've come across children being expelled from a special school setting. So if that setting can't accommodate that child's needs, where are they supposed to go? I mean, so the resources need to be put into our schools to ensure that they are inclusive and they are meeting the needs of all our children, especially our autistic children. And you made a comment there about, there's often an assumption that somebody who's non-verbal lacks intelligence, and we've heard that before in here in this committee, and that is just so untrue and so outrageous because autistic people are known to be so intelligent and have so much to offer, but there's this almost, is it a lack of awareness or a lack of acceptance? You've talked about that, and it's so important. So I think, while, and as you said, you're going to talk about all of the rights, I think we have to start with education, start with our young children. And the fact that the CNDTs are not properly resourced and children are missing out on so much. I'm just really concerned for the cohort of children now that need those services, because the workforce planning that's required to put in place a properly resourced CNDT is going to take a number of years. So obviously that has to be done. But I'm just wondering, do you have any suggestions for what could be done to accommodate the children that need the services now? Because you will hear from parents that they are actually regressing in some cases because they're not getting maybe the speech and language therapy they need, or the occupational therapy, or whatever it is. Both of you also mentioned about so many people who are living with aged parents or aged carers, and I talk to parents all the time, and the thing they worry about constantly is what's going to happen to my son or my daughter when I die. And the HSE will put them in emergency accommodation. I mean, so you have a young person, or a person, sometimes they're not that young, sometimes they're 40, 50, 60 years of age, and still living at home with parents. And they're trying to deal with maybe the grief of a death of their parent and their primary carer, and having then to get used to a new accommodation. And again, it's something that is seriously lacking. And I suppose we need accessible housing, we need supported housing for those that need the extra support, but we also need so many other, we need accessible transport, we need access to education and access to employment to make that independent and properly work for people. And Dr. Ronnie, you have done some research, and we are seriously lacking in data, proper data on autism and disability in general, and so it's welcome the research that you have done. I'm just going to ask you one figure there. You say about 28,000 it costs, I think you said euro per family. The Indicon cost of disability report that was produced over a year ago indicates that a family with a disabled member usually has an additional cost to the family of anything from 8,000 to 12,000. That's annual, or that's average. So obviously it's more for some, but I'm just concerned about that figure. It's extremely high, and I'm wondering if you're saying that's annual cost, so just maybe if you could just elaborate on that cost and where that sits with the figure that came out of the Indicon report as well, which again is a lot of extra cost on a family with a disabled member. I'm just wondering as well, this is for all of you, if any of you are involved in the work on the National Autism Innovation Strategy. Have you been asked to be involved, or are you involved, and how that is progressing? And as I suppose it's been made a case sometimes that we look at other countries to see what's best practice, but are we a country that could aspire to best practice, and what would it take to do that? Why should we have to be a follower? Could we actually be a leader if the proper resources were put into the supports that are needed? Thank you.
Absolutely agree with you about that. Inclusive education is the cornerstone and the foundation for inclusive society. So if we start with children, resourcing and investing in inclusive education that will reap benefits beyond what we can only dream of. And some of the issues that we're seeing later on for people, and Sarah Jane speaks beautifully about her experience in school and the lack of guidance that you experienced, Sarah Jane, and what that led to in terms of the lack of employment opportunities, the lack of ambition and vision. So I do think we need to absolutely invest in education and invest in an inclusive education model. And that takes, I suppose, vision and courage. Sometimes inclusive education can be seen as this polarised space. You know, it's about kind of children fitting into boxes. You know, there's special schools and special classes and mainstream, and it's like we're all vying against one another. But actually, when you bring people into a room together and you have the courage to have a conversation about that, what we're really looking for is the same thing, which is the highest quality inclusive education for children. But we know we're a long way off it, and you pointed out rightly so the many issues that are facing disabled children currently. I mean, we have contact from family members on a daily basis, and it would break your heart listening to some of the stories. We had a dad contacting us recently who has applied to 30 schools for his son. 30 schools. Like, we can all expect to apply for 2 or 3, and maybe one of those schools will come to pass, and you mightn't get your first choice, but you'll get something locally. This is 30 schools, and so many families who tell us about their experience of only getting their school place maybe at the very last minute, and that comes down to data, planning and better investment over time, and we need to see that from the National Council for Special Education and others. So yeah, investing in inclusive education, and like, I suppose what we found with our inclusive education conference, one of the biggest words that stood out to us was around trust. So there was agreement in the room that in an ideal world, yes, I'd love my child to go to my local school with their brothers and sisters. That should be the normal thing that happens in 2022. But those families told us how they couldn't trust that their child would get the individual support and help that they would need in the local school. So they're nearly pushed into making decisions that involve the child going to a different school an hour and a half down the road or 2 hours down the road. So I suppose we have to invest, and we have to build trust with families and trust with individuals that you will get the support you need. And that's going to take, to us at Inclusion Ireland, we've called for a multi-annual vision around inclusive education and step-by-step building towards that. And we know it's going to take time. We're not oblivious to that. It is going to take time and investment to get there. But as the Ombudsman has said, every decision we make should be working towards that, you know, and decreasing that polarity and coming together and saying, what do we want as a society in terms of inclusive education? What are we trying to build for people? So wholeheartedly agree about that foundation work around inclusive education. You also mentioned about CDNTs and resources, etc. And absolutely that is a chronic issue facing people at the moment. Like at Inclusion Ireland, we have said, and I know we've had conversations with you before about this, that it's not the model of PTS that's an issue. I mean, nobody can argue with fair and transparent access for children to services and supports. The unfortunate issue is that the model was not invested in before it was rolled out. So there were waiting lists before it, and those waiting lists have been compounded. And now we're seeing, you know, a third of those teams vacant. How can they possibly hope to support children in the way they need to be supported? But if the model was resourced properly, and if we do build towards that, then children should be getting support in an integrated way, whatever environment that they happen to be in, whether that's school, home, etc. And that's what the model should allow for. But unfortunately, it is only because it hasn't been invested in, and because the resources aren't there now. Really, it's so difficult for anybody to get the support that they need, and that's a real shame. So I don't know if there is a quick fix solution for that. I just think it's going to be slow and steady, working towards better, and taking our obligation seriously to resource those teams. Like in our report back in February 2022, we had over 1,000 families responding to a survey, and they told us about their experience with PTS, and 50% at least were not getting any service whatsoever, and 85% were waiting for longer than a year and a half to get any contact. And some of these children are children with the most complex needs, and there isn't a therapist in the country who goes to the trouble of going to training and doing 4 years in college who wants to be working just within that kind of environment, working with waiting lists, saying no to people. like the therapists within the system genuinely want to be there to support people, but they don't have the resources right now to do that. So that's a significant issue. And we had a number of recommendations from that report, and the top recommendation was around workforce planning strategy. And we really need to see an integrated workforce planning strategy if we're to see any hope of improvement over the next number of years. And your final question about the autism strategy, no, we're not on that group. We weren't invited to be part of that group.
So address your 3 points. So firstly, you mentioned about the Indicon report, and there's different literature about the cost of disability. I'm a trained health economist, so I did a national survey based on 195 families in Ireland who had 222 autistic children, who completed a very comprehensive survey about the economic cost for the families. So in the papers that I published that are supplied, there's a detailed breakdown out of the out-of-pocket expenditure for the families. That was over €9,449.60. Full breakdown of the different types of out-of-pocket expenditure that families are paying for, which vary from special living costs, special diet, special clothing, care and assistance that they need for their autistic child, certain amount of respite care, not an awful lot of money. Parents don't have the money to pay for respite care, paying for different medical costs, interventions, speech and language therapy, different private interventions will be a huge aspect of that. Then there are travel costs, trying to do skills training programs. So that's part of the 28,000. Then the remainder of the other 28,000 is in terms of lost income from parents having to take time off employment to, be it say that their child may need to take time out of school or have appointments, or so a certain aspect of that. And then the rest of it is the informal care costs. That is an exceptionally high figure of 28,000. It is the highest internationally in terms of out-of-pocket expenditure, and overall in terms of the cost for families. I suppose I add with caution, one of the problems is that there's little evidence and research on this, that there haven't been very detailed studies done in other countries to this level to actually calculate the cost. So there's methodological issues there that if it was done in other countries and done with the exact same survey, it would be interesting to see what the findings are, but I imagine they would be lower based on the existing evidence that is there in relation to that. So it is an exceptionally high cost. It's a cost of in a study, and there's the published papers with all the figures to back that up. In terms of then in relation to the National Autism Innovation Strategy, I applied to be involved and was not invited to be involved in it. I am the only health economist in Ireland specialised on the economics of autism, and I'm recognised internationally for my research. I work with the London School of Economics, and there's only about 3 health economists in the world specialised in this area. Then in terms of best practice and could we be leaders, I think one of the key issues is about consensus. So when I first mentioned for the 3 policy approaches, I said about a person-centred approach. So often when the more you go into autism research and being involved with autistic people and their lived experiences, they all have very different preferences about the types of services and supports that they would like. And that's extremely important because there can be some interventions that autistic people actually find more traumatic than helpful. And that's extremely important to point that out. So I did mention in relation to, say, 2 studies that are supported by the autistic community, the PAC study and the Jasper study, which are used in other countries. So that's a parent-mediated speech and language therapy programme, which has been shown to be beneficial to autistic children in the UK. It was designed there. It is being used in other countries. I suggested it, say, as looking at the enablers and barriers in an Irish context, because I'm very mindful of the strain and pressure parents are under, and to come along to some parents and suggest, okay, a parent-mediated intervention programme, they might feel that's too much of a stressful, to have the time to be involved in implementing it. So it's something that I think is worth looking at with caution of how the autistic community in Ireland would feel about it and families. Certainly in the UK, the National Autism Organisation, Autistica, support it, who have people with lived experience of autism, and the findings do show benefits in the long term for autistic children. It's the low resource intervention, and the literature and practice internationally for autistic practices is moving more towards naturalistic types of supports and interventions rather than really intensive supports with therapists. Again, different people have different perspectives on that, but that's the direction internationally where the research is showing that there's the strongest evidence of improvement in outcomes and supports. So there is lots of potential for us to be leaders in this area and to invest in it, but the issue of consensus is massive in Ireland, and there's huge variation among health professionals, the autistic community, in the direction they would like to take this. So again, it does go back, I feel, to the National Autism Innovation Strategy, you know, the more stakeholders that are involved and consensus in terms of that investing in services and supports that are respectful to the autistic community. And I can't emphasise that enough. It's not always actually implemented in certain situations. And that's, if you don't have that as your base for it, it's very problematic later to be actually, if autistic people are availing of services and supports that they actually find more traumatic. So that's something that's really crucial that needs to be looked at further in terms of developing best practice and consensus.